Um, and I want to thank IIIT for its support at various points in my career, including the research fellowship that you mentioned for manuscript writing, which contributed to this book which you have today. I want to especially thank Armin and Salat for taking care of me and for addressing my many questions and concerns. I'm very grateful for the hospitality and the warm welcome that I've received here. So without further ado, I'm going to draw today upon my new book, which you have here, and the cover is up there on the PowerPoint if you want to look at that. I'm going to draw upon Muslim American women on campus, undergraduate social life and identity, and the subtitle really kind of tells you everything that you can expect in it and everything that you probably shouldn't expect in it as well. So I'm going to tell you some Muslim college student stories and work on interpreting them as we talk. And as I talk, I'm going to rely on what scholars call raw data, which is basically, in my case, quotes from some of the research interviews that I did in order to highlight some of the key themes that are in this book. And I'm going to use those quotes to discuss some important themes related to such questions as what are some of the cultural pressures, as Armin was talking about, what are some of the cultural pressures that Muslim college students negotiate on campus? How do Muslim students balance Muslim identity and religious observance with the expectations and norms of mainstream college life in America? And what are some ways that Muslim students engage with, for example, alcohol culture, dating culture, and fashion and clothing practices on campus? Now, as to Muslim religious norms, most religiously practicing Muslims share some norms and disagree on others. We love to disagree with each other. So I'm not going to be making any pronouncements as to the correct way to be Muslim college students. I will leave that to you, but I do want to focus on the ways in which certain Muslim college students saw the conflict or the integration arising on campus. So my approach is anthropological as opposed to theological. So I do find that there are some norms and cultural practices in American campus culture that do impact what we think of as diversity or religious practice, and in particular unique ways, Muslim identity. Well, Muslim American youth experience, on the one hand, the push factor of stigma in American society, and on the other hand, the pull factor of demands for cultural assimilation. Well, this cultural assimilation takes particular forms in campus culture. In addition, there is the tension between the multiplicity of ways to be Muslim American and the essentialism regarding what a Muslim American is or should be, that we find is internalized both by our non-Muslim friends, many of our non-Muslim friends, and by many Muslims as well. To look a little bit at the methods that I used, Muslim American women on campus is based on ethnographic research. I conducted this research at two diverse private university campuses well known to all of you, Georgetown and George Washington universities, not long after 9/11. I did participant observation with the Muslim student communities at these campuses, as well as more focused participant observation and in-depth interviews with 26 primary female respondents, in particular 13 from each campus. Who's familiar with the research method that we call ethnography? Is anybody? Yeah? You want to tell us what it is?
Oh my.
Yeah.
All right, so the way I understand it, you're looking at one culture.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so in this case, it's going to be your Muslim women that are on college campus, and you're going to look at how they identify what they find are common between them, whether they're challenges, but you're talking with them as a cultural subgroup.
Great, absolutely. So the focus is a cultural group. And in this case, it is Muslim American college students, and so the focus is on that cultural group. But I don't approach them. When you do an ethnography, you don't approach them through, for example, surveys or quantitative data. How many people do what, right? The focus is through really trying to immerse yourself as a researcher into that culture, right? So. I like to use the example of a cookie, right? Anybody like eating milk and cookies? I should, yeah. So what do you do when you eat milk and cookies? You dunk it, right? You dunk the cookie into the milk, Right? And what happens is the milk seeps into the cookie, and that's what makes it so tasty. So the researcher dunks herself into that cultural group, right, and becomes sort of a marginal insider in that group, and in the process starts to understand some of the norms and practices that bind that group together, right? So you try to become an insider as opposed to watching from the outside, like some of the sort of the colonial researchers used to do with native, what they called native cultures, tribal cultures. What I did was I hung out with Muslim students on campus on an everyday basis, and also interviewed them regularly, for each one at least once a month for a year. So regularly, and those interviews being in-depth and probing and focusing on issues of identity and campus culture. Who were these research respondents? Like I mentioned, 26 young women, undergraduate women, 13 from each campus. All of them identified as Muslim, but in a variety of different ways. So, for example, I had Shias, I had Sunnis, and I had young women who identified very closely with Islam, and some young women who identified, sort of as religious, but not as very religious. So they kind of spanned the continuum of religiosity. And this was very important to me to try to represent a wide variety of different types of Muslim college students. They also came from a variety of racial, ethnic, national backgrounds. I had African American women, white women, Hispanic, and mixed race, as well as your immigrant backgrounds, including the South Asian, Iranian, Arab, African, such backgrounds. So kind of, you would say, sort of roughly representative to some degree of the kind of the East Coast Muslim community. Now, as I was thinking about my overall presentation, I realized that we can approach these findings, my research findings, using a lens that looks at Muslim Americans in this way. America is still getting to know its Muslims. Muslims are also still getting to know America. It's kind of hard work, right? And also, Muslim Americans are also still figuring out what Muslim America is. Because all of these things are not simple one-dimensional things. America is no simple one-dimensional matter, right? America is Pennsylvania Amish country, as America is Manhattan or Plainfield, Indiana. All of that is America, and it cannot be described in one-dimensional ways. Likewise, Muslim Americans are no simple matter. So we have IIIT, we have Adams, you have the Chicago madrasas, and you have Mipsters and the individual Muslims, many Muslims who have zero connection with or sense of belonging to an ethnic or religious community. So you have a huge range in terms of types and levels of religiosity and so on and so forth. So who is Muslim America? It's not defined in any one-dimensional way, and as a researcher, I don't force it into any one-dimensional box. As far as I'm able to do so. In fact, I locate many of our problems in the essentialism that attempts to say that there is an essence to all Muslims. And this is a mistake that you see, for example, in Ayan Hirsi Ali, right? That Muslims are all like this. Yeah, so these are the mistakes that I identify. So, for example, if you turn on Fox News, you'll see the top one. Muslims identified as essentially and inherently terrorist, violent, misogynistic, sexist, right? And on the other hand, you have our essentialism, which says that Muslims are all religious people. Muslims are all people who don't drink, for example, teetotalers. Muslims are all sexually chaste. Muslims are all peaceful. Muslims are all immigrants, etc. So there are mistakes on both sides, and none of these essentialized identities are workable. They don't work. They break down in the field. So I find that whether it's the top one or the middle one, they are both harmful for us. Even though some of us think that the positive projection is a useful thing, and it does present a counterpoint to the negative press that we sometimes get, but on the other hand, it's one-dimensional, and it reduces our personhood. even when we represent ourselves that way. So first of all, what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the top one, sort of, and look at the factor of stigma as it relates to Muslim college students. And I'm going to do so by taking you through the journey of a personal story. And this story is of one of my respondents. And when you read my book, you'll find her right at the beginning of the book, because she's like my favorite respondent. And I call her Intisar. All of these names are pseudonyms, of course. And she was a Somali junior in college. When she first arrived in the United States as a child, as a Somali refugee, she felt like a complete outsider. At school, she started playing basketball. She was very good at basketball, and this gave her immediate access into a cool, athletic community, mostly African American, and a persona that sort of pushed her Muslimness and her Somaliness and her refugee status into the background. So here's a quote from her interview about how basketball changed her social experience in America. She said, "You became like everyone else. You didn't have to be like a refugee. I could become part of this whole new community. I didn't feel like I had to say who I was, where I came from. Basketball defined me. It made everything easy. Basketball made you feel like everyone else. I wasn't some Somali outcast. I could just play basketball and be Intisar, who plays basketball and who also happened to be Somali and Muslim, when those things would at first define me." I added those italics because what I want to emphasize is that Intisar was not at all ashamed of being Somali or Muslim. Quite the contrary. But the problem that she had was with her the reductive effect of being identified as Muslim. It becomes a one-dimensional thing that's supposed to be self-explanatory of everything that you are. So that's the problem that she was attempting to escape, and that's what basketball did for her. It helped her indigenize, helped her become Muslim American, and it also helped her avoid the stigma, not only of race and refugee status and religion, but also class as well to some degree. So basketball helped cover her race and her religious identity. Now, when I use the word cover, I'm using the theoretical language of a sociologist called Irving Goffman. He's like my favorite sociologist, so I use him all the time. And he wrote the book on stigma. I mean, literally, he wrote a book called Stigma. So if you want to read it, it's very easy, very short, and very interesting, because what he did was he used a lot of, he did his research with, for example, prostitutes, patients in mental hospitals, and so on, and talked about how they covered these attributes that were regarded as stigma attributes in society. So in this book, he examines how stigma works. Essentially, when you have a quality or characteristic, whether it's your racial identity or your religious identity, whether it's a handicap or a physical characteristic that people react negatively to, you have what's called a stigma. Okay? So in stigma, Goffman analyzes how many people work hard to cover their stigma, to play it down, to tone it down. So let me take an example for you, which will make it a lot easier. Everybody knows this guy, right? Yeah, all the Muslims love this guy. We're just waiting for the day. So what's his name?
John Stewart.
Really? You got it. What's his name?
Leibowitz.
Jonathan Leibowitz. That was his name before kind of the Daily Show. So what happened? Why did he change it? It's what?
Sounds too Jewish.
It's too Jewish. So what he's using, this word, this change from Leibowitz to Stewart, and he also changed the spelling of it, right? So it's more Anglo, really. So what that change of name does is what Goffman calls a disidentifier, right? It helps you distance yourself from a stigma attribute. Now, everybody knows Jon Stewart is Jewish, right? It's his shtick. I mean, that's his humor. It's Jewish, right? So he's not trying to hide it, but he's trying to play it down, right? So at the outset, when you think of him, you don't say, "Oh, Leibowitz," right? It's not in your face. So you tone it down a little bit. So Jon Stewart's name is what we call a disidentifier. Intisar's basketball is a disidentifier. She's not hiding the fact that she's Muslim. She's not hiding the fact that she's Somali, but she's playing it down. She's toning it down. So these are symbols that people use to reduce their affiliation with stigmatized qualities. Martin Sheen?
Yeah.
Does anybody know his real name?
Estevez.
Ramon Estevez.
He's a Spanish guy from Ohio.
Right. So what does...
Emilio Estevez's father.
Yes. Yes. So while Charlie Sheen went to Charlie Sheen,
His
where
other
his name
son.
was Carlos, right? So some people choose the disidentifier and others do not, right? So it's really interesting how people use, and I want you to think about how you might, in certain situations, use disidentifiers in order to tone down or play down whatever it is, right?
Muhammad becomes Mo.
Muhammad becomes Mo. My uncle, and I mentioned this in my book, my uncle immigrated here in the 50s, way back, and he was like 19 years old. He was a college student, and everybody just called him Mo, and he assimilated completely. He is today a Southern Baptist. He's like, he is a Southern Baptist. That's how he assimilated. Right, so Islam in America has changed. Muslims in America have changed quite a bit. So let's return to Intisar. So she played basketball and she became part of what we call an athletic community of practice. Now, when Intisar turned 15, her mother, who was fairly traditional and from a kind of rural background, she said, now you have to start wearing hijab, and as time went on, she said, okay, now you also have to stop playing basketball because a decorous Somali woman, Muslim woman, does not play basketball. You're running around in front of men, you're playing this fast-paced contact sport with guys, this is unacceptable. So Intisar at first put on the hijab and she was a little resentful of it, and she continued to play basketball while wearing hijab. At this point, she found herself stuck between the expectations of her mother and her non-Muslim peers. Both of these sets of expectations played into each other. They were very similar. So let's look at what she says about that. She says, suddenly, my mom comes out of nowhere. You can't just be Intisar, the normal person who plays basketball. You have to carry yourself in traditional cultural way, which includes wearing hijab. I got away with it for a year, playing basketball with hijab. It's really difficult to wear hijab. People assume certain traits that should go with hijab. So the problem is not with hijab, the problem is with the traits that are immediately associated with it. And the hardest thing for me to do was to go along with those stereotypes, like hijab and basketball. I thought it was a natural thing. For Intisar, it was perfectly seamless to wear hijab and to play basketball. It's not a conflict. And my non-Muslim friends thought, can you do this? How can you play basketball? Is this allowed? So this conflict is set up for her, both by her mother and by her non-Muslim friends. So Intisar is stuck in this conflict that other people set up for her. And her non-Muslim American friends, as well as her traditional mother, obliged her to perform this stereotypical Muslim woman and to conform to stereotypes about what she could or could not do as a hijabi. So while initially basketball had, as a new American, basketball had enabled her to find a space of comfort and belonging, now once she stopped playing basketball, she was taken out of that community, and the persona she had constructed was just gone. It was erased. And she said, I had to create a whole new other person. I came out of that group, that community. If I don't play basketball, there's nothing for us to talk about. Once Intisar was no longer playing basketball, she felt bare, like a shorn sheep. As a hijabi, her difference, her race, her religion once again became her primary characteristic. So she was reduced once again to her race and religion. And like Intisar, many others of my participants felt very uncomfortable about being reduced to their faith. And this happened very often. Because of this, Muslim undergraduates sometimes tried to play down their religious lives when they were in public settings. Now, when Intisar went to college, she got an elective, because, in college you can get all kinds of electives, right? So one of her electives was basketball. So she joined this elective, and all of her class members were not Muslim. And at first they would look at her, hijabi, Somali, and they would say, we're not going to pick her on our teams. So she said at college, at first they wouldn't pick me on their teams, but then, not to brag, but I was good. And some Muslims thought it was cute that I was hijabi and played basketball, but some of them gossiped about it. So she had friends who were gossiping and saying, this is not really appropriate, she's playing with boys, etc. While others admired her for breaking the mold. So she said, I kept my basketball thing undercover, so she started to just kind of do it in private. Undercover from both Muslims and non-Muslims. I got tired of this teaching role. And I don't know if you remember the time immediately after 9/11, but everybody was just so tired. We were all so tired of explaining, right? And it, of course it carries on even now, but at that time in particular, my research respondents, I just got this sense of being so tired of the constant burden of not only stereotypes but representation as well, to constantly prove otherwise. And so she said, I just wanted to be myself. At first, basketball had solved problems for me when I first arrived in the US. So she wilted under the scrutiny and what she called the amazement of both Muslims and non-Muslims, and got tired of shattering the mold that was set for Muslim women by both groups. So Intisar eventually stopped playing basketball, and she missed it very much. Even when I talked to her years later, she said, I still miss it, and sometimes I shoot hoops when I'm by myself. Now, we Americans like to say that you have the power to do whatever you want. Every Disney movie you watch will be about that, being yourself, becoming yourself, Joe, discover yourself, right? So it's that liberal, individualistic enterprise of somehow discovering this yourself that is hidden somewhere out there, right? So my book examines some of the ways in which people are not free to be who they want, and the things that they do when they are not free to be themselves. So some Americans, when they hear Intisar's story, they want to find her and tell her, go play ball, tell your mother to get lost, right? So very often I kind of get this feeling that there's a lot of sympathy for her, and this sense that we need to take her out of that, the typical rescue Muslim woman thing, right? So they want to take her out of her family and set her free on the basketball court. But Intisar doesn't want to be free of her mother. She doesn't want to be free of her faith. She wants her faith, she wants her mother, she wants her family, and she wants her friends, and she wants her basketball, but she is forced to choose. So those are some of the things that I look at in this book. Now, Intisar's experience shows us that though identity options on American campuses are becoming almost cliche in their multiplicity, these options are not freely available to everyone. But this identity project, right, whatever it is, this Muslim American identity project, is not a new thing for as new Americans. Most non-Anglo immigrants, most minorities have experienced stigma as well as the demands to culturally assimilate. All the European immigrants who were not Anglo had to lose their languages, had to lose many of their cultural customs. The Poles, the Irish, all, even people that we now consider white were stigmatized and looked down upon and forced to assimilate. If any of you have read a book called The Chosen, if you haven't, you should, or you could go the easy route and watch the movie. There's a movie called The Chosen, and this is about Jewish migrants during wartime, when what you find there is that the secular Jews look down upon the yeshiva Jews who wear, the long forelocks and are very visibly Jewish. So they say, why can't you just fit in? Why can't you just, be moderate Jews, right? So it's very similar, very a recognizable pattern. And what they do in that book is all the yeshiva boys get together and play baseball. And Chaim Potok talks about how they just really wanted to show how good they were at baseball and how American they were. And here with Intisar, you see basketball playing that indigenized. So remember that while this is a very difficult thing, it is not unique. It's not the first time that this is happening. Another book that I highly recommend is this one called Covering, The Hidden Assault on Our Civil Rights, and it's by Kenji Yoshino, who's a Japanese-American lawyer, and he talks about how he uses covering, and again he uses Goffman as well, so that's particularly why I like him. So he uses Goffman's theoretical tool of covering, and he says that these days it's not that you're not allowed to be Muslim or black or these other things. It's not that you're not allowed to be these things. It's that, in fact, many people argue that there's a place for a commodification of these identities so that you can package your ethnicness or your religious identity and be cool and stand out from the masses and so on. But even so, the dominant culture demands that you tone down these identities, and this is what he says is the new civil rights issue of our day. That even to commodify your different identities, you package them with an Anglo background and coordinate them within a white perspective. So your disidentifiers help you cover these identities. They work in a way similar to how thick-framed glasses, like mine, make you look smart. Right? So when you wear thick frame glasses, they make you look smart, just like this is Justin Bieber, but you see that he's wearing thick frame glasses. Why? Because he's selling a book. He's written, I should say, a book, an autobiography, and he's selling it. So for that occasion, he uses this. That is to play down the image that he has normally, which is, I don't know what, basically as a ditz, right? So these are things that people use in order to play down stigmatized identities. The Muslim women in my research were aware that they were by default assumed to be different, weird, not normal, and they were working constantly to be normal, covering up stigma, and working to pass as ordinary and normal, and using these disidentifiers. Now, a major issue that I look at in my book is the pull factor of cultural assimilation as it plays out on campus. For this phenomenon, the most powerful and damaging spaces are those of campus, social, and leisure culture. Now, scholars of higher education say that other college students or your peers are the single most potent source of influence on college students. Now, we academics like to believe that it's our courses. Somebody comes to a course, it changes their lives. They read a book, they read our book, right, and changes their lives. No, it's their peers, the one they stay in dorms with, the ones they go to class with, the ones they go to the bar or the club and so on with. Those are the ones that are the most influential on college students. So, well, yeah, and so there you have one example of that. And it's not just for Muslims either. For all college students, they are the most potent source of influence. So what happens when Muslim American students, many of whom grow up within religiously observant families, and many of whom do embrace religious lifestyles, how do such youth engage with this campus environment at a college campus that is identified as a fairly big party school, for example? Well, if you ask about any school, people will say it's the biggest party school ever, right? Any school that I've ever been introduced to by any college students, they say, oh, it's the biggest party school ever. I'm just like, oh, there's a lot of biggest around. So the interesting thing that I found when I was doing my data analysis, and this was kind of unexpected for me, because I was expecting to find something quite different. I was expecting to find faith encounters on campus, and it was not even relevant. So what I found is what you'll find in the 3 data-driven chapters in my book. So the 3 main data-driven chapters that are at the center of my book are about alcohol culture, sartorial culture, that's just a big word to say clothes, and gendered and sexual behavior. So these were the 3 biggest concerns of my participants. And that's not because all of them were drinking, not at all. Most of them were not. Okay. It's not because all of them were even sexually active. Not actually, most of them were not. But It's because these factors were extremely influential within campus culture, and whether they fit in or not, they felt the pressure of these factors in campus culture. So these were the issues that jumped out when I did my data analysis. Now it's interesting that these three key practices jump out. Sometimes when I talk about my book to a mostly non-Muslim audience, they'll ask me, so what do you need to do to be a Muslim? Right, and I'll tell them, of course, you have to believe in God and the Prophet. And they say, but what about the alcohol and the clothing and the dating and all that stuff? And just like, they're part of practice, but they're not pillars. And they find this very surprising because we emphasize them so much. Right? It's interesting, isn't it? That these things, not drinking, clothing, and particularly hijab, and sexual abstinence, these become pillars of Islam. Why? Because they're differentiating factors from others, from people who are either not Muslim or not observant. So they are sociologically important, but religiously they are not actually at the top, right? But they become very, very important because they are important in more in an identity sense. So let's go to a different. Let me see if I have time for this. Yeah, I can go really quickly. Now, let's go to a different respondent in my research. Her name is Heather. She was white, she was a convert, and she was a senior in college. And she was fairly active in the Muslim student group. She was religiously observant. She didn't drink. She prayed, fasted, etc. So she passed the main tests that you give for are you a religious Muslim or not, right? So sometimes she heard her non-Muslim friends talk about their Muslim friends, and some of her Muslim friends were not allowed to date from their parents, and her non-Muslim friends were just outraged by this. They were just outraged that any parents would prevent their children from dating. So this is how she reported it. And she says, my friends said, why don't Muslims date? Their parents are insane. They need to let them be normal and let them date. They came to America. They need to just accept the fact that their kids are American. So it's a really interesting quote. And what I find is what you're seeing in this quote is a conflation, a bunching up of things, being normal and dating, right? Being normal, being American. Being weird, being Muslim, and being foreign, right? So these things are bunched up. And I like this quote because it takes us straight to the key tropes or themes that I found during my research. To Heather's peers, not dating implied a set of conclusions. You're strange, you're weird, you're uptight, you're un-American, and you don't belong in youth culture. So these were some of the underlying assumptions that a lot of people had in peer culture. And in my book, I show that peer leisure culture in social spaces is a powerful medium that constructs marginality for other ways of being. For example, one of them being Muslim religious ways of being. Many of my research respondents felt that many of their peers associated Muslims with the usual Orientalist stereotypes that Edward Said has described in his book, Orientalism, as well as a notion of Muslims being the opposite of what a normal American undergraduate is supposed to be. So these were stereotypes that in my respondents' identity work, they were constantly fighting, resisting, correcting, avoiding, and sometimes even deploying and using. So I've talked a little bit about how undergraduate culture on a secularized campus is framed within this liberal individualistic endeavor of being autonomous, growing, pursuing new experiences. So when you grow up, you become, you change, you have to change, right? This is the idea that when you go to college, you have to change in order to become you, right? In order to discover who you are. And of course, that self was to be found within the confines of mainstream youth culture. This leads us right back to the pressure on religious minorities, such as Muslims, to culturally assimilate. So what many of my respondents found was this was confusing. It was very confusing being Muslim and American because there were so many different ways to be Muslim and American. So so Layla talked about this, and this is gonna be sort of my wrap up section. So she talked about how we're also first generation, we don't know where the boundaries are. I think if you were raised in Pakistan, you'd know what limitations you really had because of people around you. Here it's so different because there's Muslim Pakistani people who will not look at a boy, and there's other people who are full-fledged dating. So this creates a confusion, right? On the one hand, you have that essentialism. Muslims are this, being thrown at you from various directions, whether Muslim directions or Fox News and the others. And on the other hand, you have this confusion of the many different choices, many different types and modalities of being Muslim. And so there is no stable or consistent, universally held set of Muslim American rules, for example, on how to find a spouse, right? That will be culturally appropriate, that will be socially appropriate, that will not get you in trouble, for example, that will not get your reputation. So, for example, many of my respondents worried of being, for example, so strict in their gendered behavior that they would not be able to find a mate. And many of them worried that they would be so not strict that their reputations would be destroyed, and then they would not be able to find a mate within the community. So these are real struggles that many of my respondents had. And actually, it's kind of a longer quote, but I'm just going to refer to it very quickly. That Fatima talked about a friend of hers who was interested in someone, and she said she's interested in him, but everyone keeps talking about her. All the Muslims keep talking about her, gossiping about her. And she said, look, we all don't know how to go about this. What would you do in her position? And then some people said, well, maybe there's a time when you tell your parents. And she said, but you don't tell them right away. You see someone and you say, oh, I'm interested in him. Then if you keep doing that, they're going to say, well, you're crazy, right? So I'm just like, we shouldn't really be judgmental because we don't have answers. We don't have workable answers, right, that work for everybody. The answers that you usually have are usually very simplistic, right? And they are often very simplistic, and they don't work within this context of ours. So my concern in this area is to tell these stories also to show that there are many different ways that people are trying to figure out their way of being Muslim, how to be Muslim in America and at college, and to allow that space, because it's always better to air out our views. It's always better to air out our concerns and questions. In the absence of that, the loneliness, the isolation, we will lose people, right? The confusion and the isolation will lose people. So I'm just going to wrap up with that, and I'm hoping that we can have some questions.